Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. Today's episode is about change and the lack thereof. We will be looking at Uzbekistan, how the country was shaped during the post-Soviet period under the regime of Islam Karimov, and what has changed since the coming to power of Shavkat Mirziyoyev. If you've been following this podcast closely, you know that Uzbekistan is my favorite country that I unfortunately cannot visit. I'm always happy to invite people who know the country well and who care about its fate as much as I do. My good friend and colleague, Joanna Lillis, has recently published a book titled Silk Mirage, Through the Looking Glass in Uzbekistan, in which she examines the history of independent Uzbekistan from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the presidency of Shavkat Mirziyoyev, with some fascinating detours into earlier periods. This is the most comprehensive account of this era available in the English language, and I highly encourage you all to read it. Just to remind you, Joanna Lillis is a Kazakhstan-based journalist reporting on Central Asia for various media outlets. She lived in Uzbekistan between 2001 and 2005, where she worked for BBC Monitoring, the BBC World Service's global media tracking service. Apart from Silk Mirage, which we'll be discussing today, she is also the author of Dark Shadows, Inside the Secret World of Kazakhstan. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Joanna. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hello, Agnieszka. It's a pleasure to be back on Turan Talks. Turan
Tales. You're basically the first person to be here for the second time, which I'm very happy.
That's a great honor.
I'm very happy because Joanna has recently published an excellent book about Uzbekistan called Silk Mirage. And I'm very happy that this book has been written because it's so far like the most comprehensive account of independent Uzbekistan. There are so many questions I would like to ask you, probably too many for this short talk. But let's start from something that I always ask my guests. Do you remember the first time you came to Uzbekistan and what did you think of the country back then?
That's a great question, Agnieszka. Thanks for asking it. I'm actually going to have to cast my mind back 25 years because it's 25 years ago this year. The first time I went to Uzbekistan, that was in 2001. So I arrived in Uzbekistan in August 2001 to take up a job at BBC World Service Monitoring in the office there in Tashkent. And it was August. Well, I'd been working before that in Moscow. So I had a lot of impressions when I arrived because it was quite a culture shock for me. First impression, of course, when I stepped off the plane, it was so very hot. And that's a very obvious impression when you go to Uzbekistan in summer when you're not used to that kind of heat. But I expected, I think, because I'd been working in Moscow for 5 years and I'd been working there for most of the 1990s, I did feel that it would be quite kind of familiar to me. And I'd traveled in other parts of the former Soviet Union as well. But I found Uzbekistan to be in many ways, unfamiliar. I mean, I found it to be a very different way of life. Of course, there's post-Soviet kind of some things around the former Soviet Union are kind of common, and there's a certain common culture that you can recognize all around, and sometimes the architecture too. But I found it to be very different, perhaps, to what I'd expected. Central Asian people, I think, are often more open than Russians, and certainly on the surface more friendly to strangers. And I found it to be a very welcoming place because of that. I was certainly used to, I'm in Moscow, a very big city and a place where, people can be quite brusque in everyday life. And Uzbeks are certainly appeared to be much more friendly. And of course, also they were very interested to see a foreigner and to talk to a foreigner. At the same time, I was very struck by the fact that people were, unlike in Russia, very reluctant to kind of talk politics. I'd lived in Moscow in the rambunctious 1990s, when it was very soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and people talked politics a lot, even though it was pretty authoritarian. There was a much open discussion of politics. And also, I was struck by, obviously, the very, very tightly controlled media. The tight censorship was absolutely shocking to me after being in Moscow. The fact that the media just reported the same things in almost the same words, the very few media that there was. So there was all these kind of impressions about the society and about the political environment. And it all came as a great big culture shock for me. I mean, in many ways, a pleasant one. But of course, in terms of the kind of dictatorship I found there, it was a very unpleasant one. You could say that. So let's say my first impressions were that I found the people very welcoming and found the government very disturbing.
But at the time, there were still independent Western journalists who were allowed to work in the country. It was the time when Uzbekistan joined the American war on terror and became a US ally and an important logistical base for the Afghanistan war. So in a sense, there was a vibrant, let's say, coverage of Uzbekistan. How did you find that? How did you find this moment of time in the history of Uzbekistan, given what happened later?
It's absolutely true what you say. There were Western journalists there, and the country was not completely closed, but it was extremely dictatorial, rivaled in our region only by Turkmenistan, and indeed rivaled in the world only by a few countries like North Korea. But there was still a cohort of Western journalists there at that time, and it was still possible for journalists to report. Now, I would emphasize that I was not doing on-the-ground reporting. I had an office job, but it was involved in journalism, so I was in very close touch with what was going on. If you'd asked me at the time, could things get much worse, I think I would have said no, because I found the level of human rights abuses to be so utterly outrageous and shocking. That, when I was living there was the time when a couple of people died in Jaslik, the infamous prison camp, the Gulag, if you like, through immersion in boiling water, so that Karimov became notorious as a dictator who boiled his opponents alive. So that was how bad it was. But of course, what we didn't know at that time was that things would get much, much worse. And after I left in 2005, things deteriorated so that a country that was already profoundly authoritarian retreated into itself and became an even more brutal dictatorship, I suppose we could say. I mean, that was a turning point. And after a particular bout of violence in the city of Andijan, which I'm sure we'll get to probably later.
Well, you talk about all those egregious crimes of the Karimov regime in your book. What was the saddest or the most infuriating story that you covered? Or maybe like the most emblematic crime that we should never forget?
Well, I mean, certainly from the time when I was there, it was actually the one that I just referred to, which took place in, I believe it was 2002. And in my office, we had access to some documents related to these deaths of two men in custody. So I'll give some background. The Jaslik prison camp where they had been held was a notorious prison camp that had been opened in 1999 after some bombings in Tashkent, specifically to house alleged extremists. Now, in Uzbekistan, the definition of extremism was, and remains actually to some degree, so loose that this net encompassed thousands upon thousands of innocent people who were jailed just because they were deemed too pious by the government. Now, this camp opened after some bombings in 1999, and the government had a complete witch hunt that encompassed thousands of people who had nothing to do with any bombings. And you could go to jail in Uzbekistan simply for example, if you wore a beard, you would be suspect because it was seen as a sign of religiosity. So that camp was notorious for its poor treatment, for torture of detainees, and many people died there, of course, under torture and in custody. So in 2002, two young men died in custody in that camp. And the finding of the autopsy showed that they had died from immersion in boiling water. They had died, and indeed, the autopsy was conducted later by independent experts. Now, the camp director said that they had a fight involving teapots, but rights activists managed to gain access to some documents showing that they had that were given to a coroner abroad who said that there were signs that they had been immersed in boiling water. I mean, that's so barbaric that it became very emblematic emblematic of the Karimov regime. And because in the office where I worked, we translated some of those documents, it very much stuck in my mind. This is the kind of regime that we are dealing with. This is the kind of country that I am now living with. And it became very emblematic because all newspaper reports in the West would then talk about the dictator who boiled his opponents alive. Now, that wasn't literally the case, but it was a very shocking and egregious case, but only one of many.
Exactly, one of many. And another thing that you've already mentioned was the Andijan massacre. So also an event that basically changed a lot in the history of Uzbekistan. You came to Uzbekistan after the Andijan events. What was the situation then? And how do you see the events after so many years?
Yeah, indeed. I actually left my job in Uzbekistan just a couple of months before the Andijan massacre. And I did actually return to Uzbekistan maybe just a month afterwards. So I was no longer working there. And I found a country certainly in shock. I didn't go to Andijan at that time, but I found a country that was in shock and was struggling to kind of process what had happened. Now, one of the striking things is, I guess we should just recap on the events very briefly, on the violence. In 2005, there was a trial happening in the city of Andijan of some kind of stalwarts of the local community. Now, they were businessmen, but also very pious businessmen who'd been arrested on extremism charges. And it's a very complicated tale, which I devote a chapter to in Silk Mirage. And I went back to Andijan a few years ago and to talk to people about what happened. And I went to Sweden as well to talk to refugees who still live there from Andijan about what happened. And there is a complication. The question is, was this an Islamic uprising when the violence started over the trial of these men, when protests started that ended in violence? That's what the government said. Or was it a slaughter of peaceful protesters? Or was it somewhere in the middle? Well, that's what I try to explore in the book. And, it's not quite as simple as it seems, but it was certainly a slaughter of people, unarmed civilians. So that's a little bit of background. As I say, read the book to find out more. But what did I find? Well, when I came back to Uzbekistan just after the massacre, I found a country that was traumatized. But of course, there was a lot of disinformation. The official propaganda was saying that this was very simplistically saying this had been an Islamic uprising in order to overthrow the government. And many people in other parts of Uzbekistan did believe that. That's one of the issues that I explore in Silk Mirage, the fact that there's never been a reckoning about what really happened on those fateful days that left, we still don't know how many people died. The government said 187. Credible accounts say at least 500 and possibly many more. So we still don't know what happened. Despite Mirziyoyev coming to power and sort of embarking on reforms, we haven't had any historical reckoning. And I think that's a trauma and a sore that can't be healed for Uzbekistan until there's been an open discussion that also might bring justice to the victims.
So let's move a little bit. You left Uzbekistan in 2005, and that's when you stopped working there as a journalist. And you returned only on the wave of what you call in the book the Uzbek Spring. This is, I think, when we too met as well in 2018. At the time, and knowing what happened in Uzbekistan, knowing what sort of regime Uzbekistan was under Karimov, did you have much hope for change?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I stopped working in Uzbekistan in 2005, and I was only able to officially work there again after the Uzbek Spring began, from after 2016, so around 2018, I received my accreditation. But in the intervening period, I visited frequently. I didn't have a personal ban on visiting, and I was able to visit on private visits, and I visited very frequently, certainly at least every year. So I was very much in close touch with what was happening. So it was certainly a fascinating time when Karimov died and Mirziyoyev came to power. And certainly when he came to power, like almost everybody else, I think, I had absolutely zero expectations that he would bring any change to Uzbekistan. I did go to Uzbekistan and actually do some reporting on his election in 2016, so soon after Karimov died. And there were certainly among the people that I spoke to, although most people, certainly strangers, would be very afraid to speak about politics, but there was very, very no expectation of change. So, Mirziyoyev basically confounded low expectations when he embarked on that Uzbek Spring. And like, everybody else, I was delighted to see some moves towards liberalization. And there was a very exciting time, a time of heady change, when you could really feel this change in the air and this kind of optimism in the air. So I'm talking about period 2017, 2018, when we met, as you said, Agnieszka, at a time when exciting things were happening, from efforts to eradicate forced labor, child labor, to the sort of collapse of the black market because Mirziyoyev removed currency restrictions, to opening of borders. And so people were, excited, optimistic. And I was certainly excited and optimistic too, because, it's a country that's become very close to my heart, and it was heartening to see positive changes. But I always thought that there would be limits on the zeal for reform. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, authoritarian leaders they may have some incentive to reform, and they may even believe in reform. But at the end of the day, if they reform too far, they're going to create political competition for themselves. And it's not ultimately in their interest. It's in the interests of their people, but it's not necessarily it's not actually probably at all in their interest. So they have to be pretty brave to go the whole hog, if you like, and to embark on really far-reaching reforms that will create, say, a democracy. So let's say that I was very optimistic. I was optimistic about the changes and excited. I was also, and remain, convinced that many of these changes are to the benefit of ordinary people, even if they don't get free elections, even if they don't get to choose their leaders. There are changes on the ground in Uzbekistan that have benefited ordinary people and made Uzbekistan a better country. But I believed then, and I believe, and I still believe, that any transition to full democracy is, a long way off, shall we say.
What was important, what Mirziyoyev did, is that he closed Jaslik, so the infamous prison that you already mentioned. And also he removed loads of names from the kind of secret list of people that were being monitored by the state, suspected extremists that the government was basically monitoring. So these were definitely good moves, and it was something that inspired this hope that things can now change. But in your book, you write about the victims of repressions and the survivors of Jaslik, and you actually show that justice has not necessarily been served, even with those big declarations of change. Can you talk a little bit about it now?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, because this question of justice and historical reckoning is really at the heart of Silk Mirage, and it's something that I really wanted to explore, and I think it's something that has been explored, enough over this last nearly a decade now. The Mirziyoyev has come to power. I would say, of course, in the early years, there's so much changing, so much going on, and he's evidently got so much on his plate that it's a bit ambitious to hope for it to be explored then. But we should remember that now we are 10 years on from him coming to power, and it is time. If Uzbekistan wants to really move on, it is probably time to explore this question of doing justice, having a historical reckoning, and facing up to the crimes of the past. So in Silk Mirage, it's something that resonates throughout the book in many ways. But I have a particular chapter where I talk to, I have a couple of chapters actually, where I talk to former political prisoners who have got released under Mirziyoyev, and I talk about how they feel about their release. Obviously delighted to be free, even after serving, sometimes a decade or two in prisons, including that very infamous prison Jaslik. As you mentioned, Mirziyoyev closed that down, which was a big symbol of his drive to put the past, the crimes of the past, behind Uzbekistan, to kind of move on from those crimes of the past. But it's not enough to just close a prison. It's a good symbolic icon of change, indeed. But there are several factors about that. And one of those is that, that there are still reports of torture coming out of other prisons in Uzbekistan. And as one former political prisoner said at the time, it's no good closing down Jaslik if torture is going to continue in other prisons. Now, okay, the government says they're tackling torture, but these cases still occur. But at heart, I wanted to talk to those political prisoners, including people like Aksam Turgunov, a human rights activist who served a decade, some of it in Jaslik, before he was released under Mirziyoyev, obviously on trumped-up charges. And he's one of the people pursuing efforts to achieve some kind of justice for the former political prisoners, to want to have some kind of reckoning. Now, his efforts are coming up against a brick wall in Uzbekistan because there's this effort to kind of gloss over the crimes of the past. Now, it's true that the government has registered one non-governmental organisation that is supposed to be kind of working on historical justice, but there hasn't been any open discussion in Uzbekistan, despite everything that's happened, despite all the changes that Mirziyoyev has instituted. There's been no open conversation about how many people were unjustly jailed. I believe, and there have been several former political prisoners who have tried to get their convictions struck down. And I think, as far as I know, that there's a grand total of one who managed to actually have that happen. There was certainly, most people have failed. Some are still trying. There were all kinds of barriers, not least the fact that the state doesn't want, it appears, to have this kind of conversation. I know that there's one very long-serving political prisoner who was told that his case could be reviewed because the files had been destroyed. So all of this contributes to an atmosphere of secrecy. Mirziyoyev kind of wants to take the credit for releasing political prisoners, and yet there isn't an open discussion of how this happened. How did it happen that so many people went to prison unjustly? Why aren't miscarriages of justice being righted? And I think those are the issues that Uzbekistan needs to tackle in order to kind of move on as a nation. And brushing it under the carpet is to the detriment of the people. Now, one point that we have to make is that it's very difficult for Mirziyoyev to kind of open that conversation or allow it to happen. Because let's face it, he was within the Karimov administration for decades, and he was Karimov's prime minister for 13 years. And so, by implication, he was part of the administration that was committing the crimes. I mean, no one's suggesting he personally committed any of these crimes, but he was part of that administration, and that makes it very difficult to talk about historical justice, transitional justice, as people sometimes call it. And I think another point worth making is that there have been high-profile releases of political prisoners, and also the thousands of religious prisoners who served time on trumped-up charges. We call them religious prisoners, people who were deemed too pious and were sent to prison on trumped-up extremist charges. Now, many of those are believed to still remain in jail. There was certainly some research which has shown that Uzbekistan still holds high numbers of people, on spurious-sounding extremism charges. So there is that issue as well. And I think an important point to make is while these prisoners, many people have been released, in the vast majority, if not all of the cases, they were released either after serving their sentences or with parole from serving their sentences. But it's not the case that they've had their convictions overturned and had their names cleared. It's the case that they are still deemed criminals. They've just been released under Mirziyoyev. And this rankles with some of the political prisoners that I spoke to. Of course, they're happy to be free. But as they told me in the interviews that I published in Silk Mirage, and this is all unique testimony, many of them would like to have their names cleared, and many of them would like to have a wide-ranging discussion about how this dictatorship happened to Uzbekistan and to Uzbeks. And it doesn't necessarily have to involve punishing, people, but they would like to see the crimes of the past laid bare. We can look at an example like South Africa, where they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the apartheid years, which involved laying the crimes bare without punishing people. Now, question of punishment is not one for me to answer, but I'm simply saying that people do point out that there are mechanisms for doing this that have been previously established. And many political prisoners, former political prisoners, believe that Uzbekistan and Uzbeks as a nation would benefit from some kind of historical reckoning.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Tehran Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. I think an important body or an important organization in this very, let's say, sophisticated repression, was the National Security Service, which under Mirziyoyev has been rebranded State Security Service. It's an organization that has been making the lives of journalists, activists, political opposition very difficult. They have been involved not only in surveillance, not only in threats and sometimes even physical force against journalists, but also in some of the most egregious crimes that we've already mentioned. So the National Security Service, or the State Security Service, is an organization that has basically been sort of a state in the state. It has had huge powers and huge influence. I also experienced their work. I know how relentless they can be, how vicious, and that it's basically impossible to win against them. And I don't think, from my experience and from the experience of other people whose cases I covered, that their modus operandi has changed much. And now the question that I've been asking myself is why this organization is so difficult to reform. Is it because the state is still so paranoid and needs a service like this to just threaten people and to make sure that there is just one center of power? Or is it because they operate independently and because they have to create the threats to the state to justify their existence? Or is it maybe just institutional memory that is very hard to break? What do you think? You obviously write about this in your book as well.
This is a really important question. And again, it's one that's not being discussed enough in Uzbekistan for obvious reasons, because that very security service is there stifling dissent. I do indeed devote a whole chapter to the security service, to how it operated under Karimov, and to how Mirziyoyev has tried to reform it, and to what the situation is today. And in order to do that, in Silk Mirage, I spoke to people who have suffered from the excesses of the security services under Karimov and under Mirziyoyev as well. So I'm talking about people like Bodova, whose brother was tortured to death under Karimov, people like Babur and Timur Yusupov, two brothers whose father was jailed on what many people believe to be spurious treason charges, and that was under Mirziyoyev. So it's an important question. I mean, I think it was very interesting to me when Mirziyoyev embarked on his reforms of the security service, taking them on, if you like. Now, the security service, the SNB, as it was known when I was living in Uzbekistan by its Russian acronym, as you say, now rebranded as part of the reforms. When I lived in Uzbekistan, an absolutely dreaded and feared institution that people wouldn't even name, but would sort of touch their shoulders to show, labels showing that they mean this kind of, officers from the security services. So it was so terrifying to people that they didn't want to talk about it, understandably. And it had incredible remit of basically anything, from ensuring national security and borders to stifling dissent. But it also had its finger in many economic pies. And I think the way that you just put it, a state within a state, that's what it became. And indeed, many people thought that it was really the head of the security service, Rustam Inayatov, who was really calling the shots when Karimov was in power. And at the very least, and I think I read this as well in a WikiLeaks cable, a cable from the US Embassy to Washington, one of those leaked cables. At the very least, the head of the security service was the gatekeeper to Karimov, who's controlling the flow of people and information. And therefore, I think it became a kind of self-perpetuating kind of monster. It was a state within a state. It was making a lot of money. It was also shaking down businessmen, taking protection money up at lower levels. It was believed to be involved in the black market currency trade, very lucrative at higher levels and at lower levels. So it was really, something that was just the foremost institution in Uzbekistan controlling, or at least involved in almost every aspect of life. It had offices in embassies abroad. It had agents in universities, everything. So, when Mirziyoyev took it on and claimed he was going to reform the people he actually called the officers mad dogs. It was quite a moment in this Uzbek spring, as I call it in Silk Mirage. And it was quite interesting to see him take it on, dismiss Inayatov, or at least retire him, and then try to restrain the remit and also rebrand it with a different name. And all these were laudable efforts. But I think the security service itself, it's an institution that has its own momentum and its own power. And I think it definitely fought back. I mean, we saw a spate of spurious kind of treason cases and spying cases that I know you covered some of them yourself, Agnieszka, at that time. Very spurious sounding charges that led people to go to prison for sharing information that didn't look as if it could possibly be classified or secret. And I think that was part of the fight back of the security services. Look how necessary we are. Now, I mean, we see them now again at the forefront of fighting dissent, cases against journalists, civil society activists. So what's changed? Well, I'm not sure. I think it's still an organization that operates with very little accountability, if any, and with very, very great amounts of all-encompassing powers. Why was it not possible to reform it to the degree that it should have been reformed? Well, I think the vested interests within the security services are just too powerful. And it's also, on the one hand, they don't want to lose their power, their positions of power, their jobs, their salaries, also their ability to extract, rents or extract, bribes or all across the board. There is a question of power and them not wanting to relinquish it. And that goes at the higher levels and at the lower levels too. And also, I think there's also the question of Mirziyoyev cannot afford to alienate the security service too much, I suppose. He needs some kind of bastion behind him to ensure he stays in power. So again, just like with other reforms, we see kind of half measures. We see that Mirziyoyev appears to know what needs to be done, but he can't push it to the end and actually achieve the sort of stated end goal, which is a tamed and accountable security service in this case.
Your book is very dense, and actually, I could talk forever about everything that you write about. But let's just talk about one more thing, which is the protests in Kazakhstan in summer of 2022. You were the only foreign journalist who entered Kazakhstan after the virtual collapse of any communications during the protest. And just to remind our listeners, according to official data, 21 people died in the protests, which were sparked by the planned amendments to the constitution that would strip the region from its autonomous standing and the right to secede. After those amendments were announced, they were very quickly removed by Mirziyoyev. He decided not to introduce them, but the protests already started and they turned very violent. So what exactly happened, and how did you find Kazakhstan when you arrived there as one of the first journalists following the violence?
Yeah, it's very important to talk about Kazakhstan. So thank you for asking about that. It's something that hasn't been talked about enough, and not just in Uzbekistan, of course, but generally, it hasn't achieved much resonance certainly at the time in the international media. I think it's something very poorly understood, and it's something that needs to be understood, because the violence in Kazakhstan in 2022 was something of a watershed for Mirziyoyev. But before that, there was, lots of talk of reform and the Uzbek Spring and positive news. Of course, things were already souring. The reforms appear to be slowing. But, this kind of protest where unarmed protesters get shot dead was very reminiscent of the Andijan violence, although the death toll was evidently far, far lower. But it was certainly the worst violence in Uzbekistan since that Andijan violence in 2005. And it was an uncomfortable picture for Mirziyoyev, who paints himself as a reforming president. So when I arrived in Kazakhstan, which was just in the hours that the violence was dying down, I found, Nukus, the capital of Kazakhstan, a city in the grip of kind of shock and terror, actually. People were extremely frightened. I spoke to people who had witnessed, people being lacerated by, whatever had been fired at them. The people wouldn't know, but they'd witnessed people collapsing in pools of blood, and they'd witnessed this incredible explosion of violence. And so people were very shocked, very frightened. But they were also, if there was a safe space, and they managed to create some safe spaces by simply going to the bazaar, which was actually closed, but there were some people around there, and talking to people there. Even though there were security forces patrols, it was possible to kind of sneak aside, find a space where they couldn't see you. So I managed to talk to people, and when they felt that they were in a safe space and were able to talk, then they talked about, what had happened. And really, it came across to me as a case of something that could so easily have been prevented. It was a case of high-handed government, in the manner of authoritarian governments, making decisions by including these proposals to strip Kazakhstan of its autonomy in this very much wider package of constitutional changes, without talking to the Kazakhs, without even wondering what their reaction might be. And their reaction was an explosion of anger on social media. Then the government blocked social media, and then people ended up eventually taking to the streets. And in fact, they took to the streets not really, the catalyst was the arrest of Davlet Tajimuratov, a very respected community leader who had been arrested. And that's what made them take to the streets. So if it hadn't been for the constitutional amendments, or for not consulting with the Kazakhs, or for not arresting a civil society leader, I guess none of this would have happened. How it turned violent, obviously both sides blamed each other. But I think the point was that this was a high-handed constitutional reform that sparked anger, that sparked protests, that were put down very violently. And then another point we should make is that at the end of the day, the government didn't blame itself for, or Mirziyoyev's administration didn't blame itself for bungling this constitutional reform. Instead, it claimed there was a separatist plot. There was no evidence of any separatist plot, although some of the people I spoke to did express a desire to succeed peacefully, and there was no evidence of that. And even the trials, I attended the trials, and even at the trials, although most of the accused admitted to guilt to one degree or another, none of them, not a single one, ever admitted to involvement in a separatist plot. But Davlet Tajimuratov, that respected community leader, is now serving a 16-year prison sentence, if I'm not mistaken, on charges of spearheading that plot, of which there is no evidence. So I think one of the issues is the miscarriages of justice that the human rights activists point to. There are some similar scenarios with what used to happen under Karimov when things went wrong. Point fingers, find scapegoats. And I think that's one of the particular points that we should think about with Kazakhstan. Many of the similar mistakes from the Karimov era being repeated. And again, we're talking about justice, one of the themes of Silk Mirage. I don't see much evidence that justice has been done in this tragic case.
You see, this is so interesting because your book is obviously full of those tragic stories, very pessimistic, in fact. And it's very hard to pitch stories from the region, from Central Asia, because media outlets don't care. And yet, everywhere, I can see positive stories coming from Uzbekistan about the Third Renaissance, about Buhara Binyali, about all those amazing changes. Why is that? How is it possible that all those flashy stories are being published in Western media and yet at the same time stories that are really important are not really accepted by editors? Is it that the new Uzbekistan has a really good PR army of people, or is it something that we don't understand about modern media landscape?
Yeah, this is a very good point. I think as journalists here in Central Asia, Agnieszka, we all face this frustrations that it's hard to get the stories out in the international media often. And that often we're seeing this glut of positive stories, and yet, some of the important stories are just not getting out there. I think one of the issues is definitely the very slick PR machine that the Mirziyoyev regime has developed. They're very, very savvy in a way that the Karimov regime never was. Maybe they just didn't care, but the Mirziyoyev regime does care about its image abroad. And I think I like your expression, army of PR people. Yes. I mean, there are PR agencies, slick London PR agencies or wherever, working to place stories about Uzbekistan. There are, frequent press tours to go and see positive things about Uzbekistan. For example, I attended a conference maybe 18 months ago about architecture, Tashkent modernist architecture, which the government's trying to promote. And there was hordes of international journalists, well, not hordes, but dozens maybe, flown in and kind of shown a good time and then focused only on that topic, which is a positive topic, of course. But they don't, they get kind of blinded to other stories and they're only there to cover that story. So they don't have time or maybe can't be bothered. I don't know. But they don't get to go out there and talk to people about anything else, about other aspects of the country that, that they should be also looking into. So I think that's one issue. I know that you did a very interesting podcast about reputation laundering, what they call reputation laundering, with Uzbek academic. I'd urge listeners to listen to that to learn more about that. About how the government does sort of launder its reputation. And I write in Silk Mirage about how it uses art and culture and heritage in order to kind of promote this positive image about the country. And that's all positive, and those things are all true and positive. But at the same time, they kind of try to use it to cover up some of the bad things that are happening in the country. And I write at some length about that in Silk Mirage, so people can read about it there as well as listening to that podcast that I recommended. I think it's important for journalists to stay clear-eyed. I mean, I think the Uzbek government is very adept at wooing journalists or foreign visitors, the international community, putting on a great show. And in fact, they've been doing this since Soviet times when Uzbekistan was a center of diplomacy, when Tashkent was actually a center of diplomacy to showcase, the Soviet Union to the developing world. So they've got decades of experience of this. But I think it's important that hopefully readers can see beyond that. And I hope that Silk Mirage will at least bring a true picture of Uzbekistan, including the pluses and the minuses, including all those positive things, the art, the textiles, the culture. But the two things are not exclusive. All those things can be there positive, but there can also be incredible repression that hurts and ordinary people and damages, Uzbekistan as a nation. I hope that Silk Mirage will give that nuance, will give across that nuance to portray Uzbekistan in all its complexity.
Yeah, I hope that all our listeners will now go and buy Silk Mirage because it's a fascinating book. It's a really great and honest account of what's been happening in Uzbekistan since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Joanna, you haven't got accredited in Uzbekistan now.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I had accreditation when the government started issuing accreditation to foreign journalists after, around 2017, 2018. Part of the grand changes, and these were grand changes. It was so exciting to be able to go back to Uzbekistan to work as a journalist. This would have been, say, 13 years after I'd last had accreditation. And that was a great time for me. I was able to, for the next 5 years or so, I was able to go anywhere, to talk to anyone, to cover anything. But unfortunately, and I think this is a sign of the backsliding that we've been witnessing in recent years, my accreditation hasn't been renewed since I covered the violence in Kazakhstan in 2022. The next time I applied for my accreditation in 2023, it was not renewed. And I've applied a couple of times. My outlet has written letters to the government, but we are told always that it's pending. But this is now, nearly 3 years. I guess it's about 3 years since the accreditation lapsed. And I think it's not to Uzbekistan's credit that it shuts out foreign journalists. And you're another foreign journalist, Agnieszka, that it's shut out. And I think it's very much not to the country's credit. And I think if they want to be seen as a reforming, investor-friendly country, I think they should give free access to all journalists and stop repressing Uzbek journalists who try to report the truth.
Maybe I'm an optimist, but I really hope that one day you and I will eat in our favorite Pakistani restaurant in Tashkent once again. And I also hope that we'll have a glass of wine at the Ankhor River as well, which in my favorite spot that I don't think I've ever shown you. But I really believe that this is going to happen. So this is what I wish you. And thank you so much for being with me and for this amazing conversation. And all the best to you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I also hope we'll be meeting in Tashkent very, very soon. And thanks for the invitation to appear on Turan Talks.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.